Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, 'How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'"
Matthew 22, verse 1. And again Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast." But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops, and destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads, and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find." And those servants went out into the roads, and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot, and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen." Verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us, then, what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. Verse 23. The same day Sadducees came to him, who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her." But Jesus answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living." And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. Verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Verse 41. Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." And he said to them, "How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Matthew 22 begins where Matthew 21 ends. Jesus is still in the temple. Jesus is still talking with the crowds, but also has been approached by the Pharisees and the Herodians. They come with the intention of entangling him in his teachings. As we said on Monday, this is the last week of Jesus' life before he is crucified, and a lot of his teachings, a lot of his parables during these final days are directed against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and the Jews. In fact, other than the time surrounding the parables of Matthew 13, we have more parables recorded here during this final week than at any other time. So Jesus tells this parable of the wedding feast. The king, God, gave a marriage feast for his son, Jesus. And the parable deals with who was invited first in verse 3. We see this being the Jews, right? The Jews first, God's chosen people. But verse 8 tells us that they're not worthy. They rejected the gospel, and even we'll see later in Acts, the Jews seizing the servants, mistreating them, and killing them. I think verse 7 is interesting. The king is angry, sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Many think that this is a prophecy about what happened to Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, where the Roman army set Jerusalem on fire, killing many of the Jews and destroying really their center of worship. Tradition tells us that no Christians died during the seizure of Jerusalem and the destruction, and we'll talk more about that later in the year. So what does the king do? He sends to all those others. Those aren't worthy, have rejected, so go to the highway, as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast, the Gentiles. This is talking about the Gentiles. We've already seen in Matthew where Jesus has pointed to Gentiles as having more faith than the Jews. So here the gospel is given to both good and evil, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But then we have something very interesting happen. Verse 11, the king looks around at the dinner guests, and he sees a man there who's not dressed in wedding clothes. And he was asked the question, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? And the man didn't say anything. But then verse 13, bind his hand and foot, cast him into the outer darkness. There'll be great gnashing of teeth. What is this about? So he didn't have the right clothes on. Why is that such a big deal? Well, for us, it's hard to imagine anyone going to a wedding and everyone there is in dress clothes, and here comes somebody wearing clothes that are not appropriate for a wedding. Let's just say sweatpants and a t-shirt. Well, we would all say, well, that is just inappropriate. Why is he wearing that? But I don't know anyone who would say, hey, take that guy, bind hand and foot, throw him out into the outer darkness. So maybe there's a little disconnect for us to understanding what is really going on here. You should know that in the first century, when guests were invited to a wedding, they were given the same garments to wear in order to indicate that they were invited to the wedding. That was their wedding invitation. So the implication is clear here. He was trying to be part of the wedding feast without doing what was required. You understand that this guest chose not to wear the wedding garment. He had no excuse for himself when asked by the king why he was not wearing the wedding garments. Only those who obey Jesus are invited into the feast. We will see in many verses in the New Testament, Mark 16:16, Galatians 3:27, that when we believe and are baptized into Christ, we have clothed ourselves with Christ. So the message here is we are invited to the feast of God. We need to do what the Lord requires. These Jews have not done so. So now they try again. Verse 15, what about taxes? What about paying taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay taxes to Caesar? What is your opinion? Again, this is a test. We are to obey the laws of the land. We are to pay our taxes. And I love the fact that after he tells them, hey, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. Give each their due. And they marveled. They couldn't find anything here to say, aha, there he is. He's violating the law of the land, or he's violating the law of God. He stumps them yet again. So, verse 23, the Sadducees ask about resurrection. In particular, this question about who will be the husband of this woman in the resurrection? The problem with the question is the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection. So already they don't believe this is going to happen to begin with. This is just to test him again. And Jesus sees right through that and tells them, notice here that God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not was their God, am their God, meaning that they still live. There is an afterlife. Finally, we get the question of the greatest commandment. Now there are over 500 commandments in the law of Moses. So how do you decide what is the greater? They're all from God, meaning they're all equally important. God didn't have any commands that were, whatever. They were all important. Yet Jesus had an answer. And it's interesting here that Jesus does not tell them one of the 10 commandments. This commandment is better than all the rest of the 10 commandments. He doesn't do that. The commandment that he gives is found in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 30. 3 times this commandment is given. And he also gives them that second commandment, that is the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. That's only found once in the Old Testament in Leviticus 19 and verse 18. So why didn't Jesus give them one of the 10 commandments? Because these 2 commandments summarize the entire law. You think about it. This is such a profound statement and pointed insight that could only come from the author of the law. Just look at the 10 commandments, for example. This first one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, right? 100% of all of your being. That pretty much sums up the first 4 of the 10 commandments. And then the second commandment about loving your neighbor as yourself sums up all the rest. That means I'm not going to steal from my neighbor. I'm not going to covet from my neighbor. It means I'm not going to murder my neighbor. All of the law. This is one of my favorite passages in all of the Bible. These things, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor, that is the key to everything. How much better this world that we live in would be if everyone loved the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, body, and love their neighbor as themselves, doing to others the way that I would want to be done, treating others fairly, compassionately, gracefully, demonstrating real love towards each other. That would be a perfect society. But because of sin, we do not have that, do we? Because of sin, we see violations of both these commands every single day. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because this world is full of those who do not love God and who do not love their neighbor. And who is my neighbor? We'll see that later in this year as well. Chapter 22 does end with the question in verse 42, when Jesus asks, what do you think about the Christ? He's setting the stage. Verse 45, if then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? Jesus is on a whole different level than they are. And so, no more questions. No more attempt to try to catch him in a bad answer. Jesus firmly and gracefully puts all that to rest. In closing today, think about those 2 greatest commandments and what you can do today to implement those in your life. Thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.